Shall we?
Yes.
Great. So, hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have all of you here. My name is Italo Lins Lemos, and on the behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to welcome all of you to the second International Colloquium on the Metaphysics and Semantics of Fiction. For the second edition, we have chosen the topic Truth and Fiction because since David Lewis' homonymous paper published in 1978, this has become a great philosophical puzzle in the analytic community. After all, is there such a thing as truth and fiction? If so, how is it possible? If not, how can we say that it is true that, for example, according to the story, Sherlock Holmes is a detective instead of an astronaut? Or how are we supposed to make sense of Anna Karenina's opening that says, all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way? Or, which is even more puzzling, how can we acquire any sort of knowledge about the world through fiction if propositional knowledge is some sort of justified true belief? Truth and fiction pushes us to develop intricate arguments in metaphysics, aesthetics, philosophy of language, and epistemology. And in order to tackle this problem directly or indirectly, we have invited some of the most influential philosophers in the field. So, first and foremost, I would like to thank Professors Francesco Berto, Amy Kind, Fiora Salles, John Gibson, Julia Lencao, and Eleonora Orlando for kindly accepting our invitations to deliver their conferences in this colloquium. We, here in Brazil, have been studying their works for some time, and it is a great honor to have the opportunity to discuss their ideas with them. I would also like to thank all the 15 researchers from 4 different continents that sent their abstracts to our scientific committee and now are going to present their works on fiction. We have received more abstracts in this edition of the Colloquium in comparison to the first edition, and it makes us really glad to have your trust and see that the community is growing. And of course, I would like to thank my friend and co-host, Jerzy Bzozowski. Organizing colloquiums is definitely challenging, but with Jerzy, the experience has been, one more time, unproblematic, enriching, and why not, fun. Even if our time is short and our energy constantly low, because we are both coordinators of the graduate programs in our respective universities, organizing this colloquium has been a joy. So thank you very much for this partnership, and let's keep it up.
Thank you.
With
Thank
that
you.
being said, uh, allow me to make a felicitous performative. The second International Colloquium on the Metaphysics and Semantics of Fiction has begun. Excellent. So let me introduce our first professor in this colloquium, which is Professor Francesco Berto. So Professor Francesco Berto works on logic, ontology, formal epistemology, philosophy of language, and philosophy of computation. He joined the department and the Arche Research Center at the University of St. Andrews in 2018. And he also works at the Institute for Logic, Language, and Computation at the University of Amsterdam. His research has been funded by the British Research Council, the European Research Council, and the Leverhulme Trust. Franz Berto is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the Philosophical Quarterly. He has published so far 7 books in English, including Impossible Worlds with Mark Iago, Ontology and Metontology, a Contemporary Guide with Matteo Plebani, and Existence as a Real Property. And he has also published 8 books in Italian. He has also published 43 papers in English and 13 papers in Italian. And today, Professor Berto is going to deliver the conference Meinongian Quantification, Equivocation, and Existence. So, Franz, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It is an honor to have you here.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Let me start by sharing my slides. And okay, you should see my slides now, right?
Yes.
People nodding. Yeah, so we're there. Good. So I should begin with kind of an apology, because when Italo invited me to a conference on fiction, fictional objects within fiction, I just told him, look, I haven't been working on this stuff for a long time. I just do logic now. So I really can't prepare new material because, as I told him a few minutes ago, I'm head of department now in St. Andrews, which is a total disgrace, of course. So I have very little time for new research. But he said, well, we're fine if you come up with old stuff. So this is in fact not new stuff, but I hope at least it's interesting. And it's about the metaphysics of fictional objects, but more generally, it's about Meinongianism, because, hey, I'm a Meinongian, okay? So if you're into the metaphysics of fictional characters, and you ask a philosopher like, what the hell is Sherlock Holmes? If they answer, look, there is no such thing as Sherlock Holmes, we just make believe that there's such a thing, blah, 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 they're probably a fictionalist. If they say, yeah, Sherlock Holmes exists, it's just some kind of abstract object, maybe an object that has been produced somehow, they're usually labeled as realists or realist abstractionists. And there's a few people like me who, to that question, would reply, well, Sherlock Holmes is a non-existent object, okay? So people like me believe in non-existent objects. We believe that some things are non-existent, but still they can have features and properties. We can refer to them. We can say true things about them, and so on. So today I want to talk about two objections to Meinongianism, which are different from each other, but they have two features in common, which is my excuse for discussing them together. One is that they are both meta-ontological in some sense. They involve the very notion of being or existence, not the extension. And another one is that another feature that they have in common is that if they are right, they imply that Meinongianism is not just bad, but it's not just wrong, it's badly wrong. Okay, so Meinongianism is wrong in a very, very radical way. Okay. So to introduce the two objections, I will start with a citation. So I'm quoting the very initial words of an introduction to ontology, just been written by an established metaphysician and also a good friend of mine, an old friend of mine. So this is an introduction to ontology. Okay, that's how the book begins. And it's supposed to be for beginners, okay, people who have not been exposed to philosophy at the level of university level. Okay, so this is what they are first told when they start learning ontology from this little textbook. Okay, so it says, it's customary to identify ontology with that branch of philosophy that originates from the question, what is there? And it's customary to claim that this question has two kinds of answer. First answer is easy, if not trivial, can be summed up in one word, everything. As Quiner's written, everything exists because it makes no sense to speak of non-existent entities. And those who think otherwise would manifest not an ontological disagreement, but a misunderstanding of the very concept of existence. Precisely because it would be inconsistent to claim that something does not exist, though to claim that everything exists is tautological, that is devoid of content, therefore of interest. Okay, I have flagged in italics those two claims. Something does not exist, everything exists. We'll get back to them several times. So yeah, the book is called Ontology, and the author is this guy, Achille Varzi. We go back a long time. He's a good friend of mine, but he is also a committed anti-Meinongian. Okay, so it's no surprise that he starts his introduction to ontology trying to push students in what he thinks is the right direction from the beginning. Okay, okay, so here's the two claims, right? I'm calling them the M claim and the Q claim. The M claim is there are things that do not exist. The Q claim is everything exists. And you may have guessed already why I labeled them M and Q, right? One is the Meinongian claim. Okay, there are things that do not exist. And the other one I'm just gonna call the Quinian claim. Everything exists. Because you know how Quine begins. That's the very first word of another very important work. So Quine's On What There Is, where Quine begins by saying, well, what's peculiar about the question of ontology is that you can phrase it in 3 words, what is there? And also you can answer in 1 word, everything, right? Done. Now, Quinians think that Meinongianism, the view that some objects do not exist, is not just wrong, but it's badly wrong, as I said. Okay, here's a couple of quotations. So here's Bill Lycan from late 70s. I really cannot understand relentlessly Meinongian quantification at all. To me, it's literal gibberish or mere noise. Peter Van Inwagen. In sum, there are no things that do not exist. This thesis seems to me so obvious that I have difficulty in seeing how to argue for it. Okay. Jason Stanley. Surely there are no non-existent objects. Surely that's a truism if anything is. Okay. So the implicator is, it's not just a false view, it's a view which is false in a very bad way. Okay, so I want to extract the 2 objections or the 2 phrases that recapitulate the 2 objections from the initial quote that I gave you from the Achille Varzi Intro to Ontology. Because Achille there says, it makes no sense to speak of non-existent entities. And those who think otherwise would manifest not an ontological disagreement, but a misunderstanding of the very concept of existence. Okay. Call this, or the objection you can extract to this, the objection from equivocation. Why so? Because you may develop the objection in the following way. You may say, well, Q and M, the Q claim and the M claim appear to express contradictory propositions, but they don't. The Meinongian asserting M, some things do not exist, is not really disagreeing with the Quinian, just displays some basic misunderstanding, or to use a Quinian catchphrase, is changing the subject. Okay, that's still Quine on, debates on alternative logics, as he used to say, deviant logics. Okay, and says, well, when the deviant logician thinks they're changing the logic, actually they're changing the subject. Okay, so when the intuitionistic logician comes up and says, excluded middle is not logically valid, looks like they're changing the logical doctrine, but when they reject the view that P or not P is a logical truth, actually they're changing the meaning of something. Okay, maybe they mean something different by not. Okay, from what the classical logician means. And something similar would be going on here, according to the objection from equivocation. The other objection, again, going back to the initial quote from Achille, goes like this. Says, it's easy, if not trivial, to see that the M claim is false. Just as to claim that everything exists is tautological, so it is inconsistent to claim that something doesn't exist. I call this one the objection from analyticity. Why this level? Well, because you may develop it the following way. You may say, well, the Q claim and the M claim really express contradictory propositions in the debate, and the Q claim expresses some easily recognizable tautological or near tautological analytic truth. That is to say, a Frege analytic truth. You know what's a Frege analytically true sentence? It's a sentence which is synonymous with the logical truth. Okay, so take the sentence, replace a part with another part which is a synonym, you get a logical truth. Okay, that's a Frege analytic truth. Well, then the M claim expresses an easily recognizable, near and consistent Frege analytic falsity. Okay, so if you just replace some expression in the M sentence with a synonym, you get a logical falsity. So you cannot raise the 2 objections together in one breath, because objection 2 assumes something that objection 1 denies, namely that the M claim and the Q claim really express contradictory propositions in the debate. Okay, but still, I think it's okay to lump them together or to discuss them together for the 2 reasons that I mentioned at the outset. Okay, they're both kind of meta-ontological in nature as objections, and they both imply that Meinongianism is not just false, but false in a particularly bad way. Okay, so let's start with the first one, the objection from equivocation. So I'm going back to a certain view of analyticity, which has been labeled epistemological conception or conceptions, because there's a full family of them, of analyticity. But the view is that some sentences are analytic truth in the sense that if you fail to recognize them as true, that's enough to conclude that you are misunderstanding. Okay, there are sentences such that understanding mandates assent. If you understand the content, then you have to say yes, they must be true. But the other way around, by contraposition, if you don't accept them, it must be because you got some meaning wrong. Okay, so objection one has it that the Quinian claim is one such sentence. So in this view, the Meinongian who's asserting the M claim aims at contradicting Q, perhaps. They just show lack of some linguistic or conceptual competence needed to fully grasp what these people are trying to deny. Then what the M claim means, the mouth of the Meinongian, is not really the contradictory of what the Q claim means. Parenthetical remark, one may wonder whether the M claim means anything at all, or it's just gibberish or mere noise, like William Lycan said. But of course, change from meaningfulness to meaninglessness is meaning change already, and enough to fail to contradict. Now, when people come up with this kind of remark, it's natural to ask, well, on which word or words specifically is the Meinongian equivocating, right? Because if you look at the Q claim and the M claim, so there is no word which is mentioned in those sentences. Words are only used in those sentences. And on the face of it, those sentences are not about meanings. They're not sentences that say, oh, this means that, okay? They're just sentences that use everyday words like some, all, things. Usually, in this kind of meta-ontological debates where some claim of equivocation pops up, the quantifiers are the usual suspects. That happens very often, right? So, you know, if you're like a deflationary, maybe neo-Carnapian meta-ontologist of the like Eli Hirsch kind, you're gonna come up with this kind of example to show that ontologists who seem to be contradicting each other, actually they're not contradicting each other, they're talking past each other somehow. And that's because they gave different meanings to some of the words they use. And normally that's quantificational expression. So typical examples, you got one metaphysician, DKL, who claims there exist tables and coins Eiffel Tower fusions, right? Maybe because DKL, yeah, you easily have guessed who this guy would be, David Lewis. They believe in an unrestricted merological composition principle. Then another metaphysician comes up, PVI, and they say, oh no, there exists neither coins Eiffel Tower fusions nor tables. There's only simple arranged table-wise. Okay, PVI, Peter Van Inwagen, right? Looks like David Lewis and Peter Van Inwagen are contradicting each other, but they actually are not, according to some deflationalists like Hirsch. Actually, the debate is in some sense shallow. PVI, DKL just don't contradict each other. They mean different things, but they exist. So maybe what's going on here in the Quinian versus Meinongian controversy is something similar. Maybe Quinians and Meinongians too mean different things by their respective there are and every in the Q claim and the M claim. Now I think that's all wrong. And I agree on this with the committed Quinian, Peter Van Inwagen, of course, who's a hardcore anti-Meinongian, who claimed the neo-Meinongians and I, so the people I'm arguing against and myself, we mean the same thing by the unrestricted quantifier. Okay, the kind of quantifier that we may come up with in the ontology room. We are trying to avoid any contextual restriction of our quantificational devices for the purpose of doing ontology. Why is that so? Why do I think that Van Inwagen is right? So I'm basically piggybacking on a certain Williamsonian strategy against epistemological conceptions of analyticity as I sketched them a few slides ago. So Williamson has very influential arguments on that. I'll just quote the conclusion of the arguments that he comes up with, which is the following. That's from the first edition of the Philosophy of Philosophy. Williamson says, no given argument or statement is immune from rejection by a linguistically competent speaker. In particular, Quine's epistemological holism in two dogmas undermines his notorious later claim about the deviant logician's predicament, the one that I mentioned before, the one that's behind the Quinian motto, change of logic, change of subject, right? So when he tries to deny the doctrine, he only changes the subject. So why is that so in our case? Well, there's a widespread and I think very plausible view of linguistic competence in general and lexical competence in particular, which has it that competence in a given language is holistically entailed by full participation in the communication practices of the relevant linguistic community. Okay. Now, expressions of quantification like every, there is, and some, and any, and most, and so on, they're words that a competent English speaker uses effortlessly in everyday talk. As Williamson stressed in his campaign against epistemic analyticity, it is vital for mainstream accounts of reference, in particular, that the intention to use an expression with a referent it has in the community be normally successful. Now, Meinongians are clear that they want their words to be interpreted as words of ordinary English, and this should be taken into account when assessing semantic competence. Now, I'm not a native speaker of English, but here's a native speaker of English who's also a friend of mine, Suki Finn. Suki is a Meinongian. She did a PhD on fictional characters, Meinongianism, and meta-ontology. Okay, she is English, native English speaker. She was linguistically competent in English. In particular, she could use any ordinary language quantification expression from English perfectly competently, way before learning anything about Meinongianism, way before learning anything about ontology, and way before forming her convictions concerning Meinongianism, existence, meta-ontology, and so on. Now, Suki may have been led or maybe misled, if Meinongianism is false, into believing in the Meinongian claim, some things do not exist, by generalizing from a large number of common sense quantified claims that she heard since she was a child, uttered by people from a linguistic community. Some examples I picked from the literature. People may come up with claims like, there's something which has been sought by many, namely the site of Atlantis, but it doesn't exist. Some of the gods are tempestuous, but of course there are no gods exist. I thought of something I would like to give you as a Christmas gift, but I couldn't buy it for you because it doesn't exist. Okay, we all talk like this. And it's implausible that the quantifier changes its meaning in the Meinongian's mouth, like in Suki's mouth, or that Suki started, unbeknownst to herself, to equivocate when she moved from accepting sentences such as these to accepting the obvious generalization, which is the EM claim. Some things do not exist. If native English-speaking Meinongians were linguistically competent at the time of their understanding and use of quantified sentences like the above, they still are. Then, adopting a Williamsonian conclusion against epistemic analyticity, we can't understand them better, and them is whoever has a deviant position, like in ontology, logic, non-classical logicians, or whatnot, if we translate their word, in this case, word of quantification, by some non-homophonic expression, or treat it as untranslatable. But the same holds for the other bits of language in the Q claim and the M claim. These include only everyday super common words like thing, not, and of course, exists. Okay, so Williamson's point applies to them too. Now I think that focusing on the word exists is what can help us to get a better picture of the debate. That's what Fanny Wagon does. I'm quoting him again because I completely agree on him on this point too. Fanny Wagon says, you will misunderstand what I have been saying if you take me to have been saying that neo-Meinongians on the one hand and I on the other mean two different things by exist. The neo-Meinongians and I have different theories about what exist means. When they use the English word exist, they mean by it whatever it means. And if that happens to be, as I say it is, not or not, they mean not or not by exist. Although, according to their mistaken theory about the meaning of exist, that is not what they mean by it. I think this is the right way to understand the situation. Now, you may have a weakened or maybe more sophisticated version of the objection from equivocation. You may call it the objection from theoretical equivocation. It goes as follows. You may claim that, well, which feature or properties picked out by the two theories or families of theories, Meinongian views, broadly Quinian views, that's determined or partly determined by the principles characterizing the notion. You may take those principles, whatever they are, as a kind of implicit characterizations or definitions of the relevant concepts. There's again a parallel with debates in non-classical logic or between classical and non-classical logics. Take debates on negation. There's this view that says, well, the meaning of negation in a logical theory is characterized, if implicitly, by the logical principles that hold for the relevant logical operator. And that's all there is. And because we have many different logics, well, there is no such thing as negation. Okay, I'm quoting Graham Priest. That's a view that Graham considers. He doesn't endorse it. Okay, I'm quoting him because he phrases it very clearly, but he thinks it's wrong, and I also think it's wrong, and it's wrong for the same reason for which the objection from theoretical equivocation concerning Meinongianism is wrong. So the view is there's no such thing as negation. There are lots of different negations: Boolean negation, intuitionist negation, De Morgan negation. Each of these behaves according to a set of rules. Each is perfectly legitimate, and we are free to use whichever notion we wish, as long as we're clear about what we're doing. Now, do the Meinongian and Quinian talk of different features, properties, at least in this sense? When they speak with the vulgar, they mean the same by exists. But when they engage in theoretical reflection on existence, they end up characterizing different things. So the Meinongian view characterizes one notion, the Quinian view characterizes a different notion, and that's all there is. Now, I think that doesn't make sense of the actual debate between the two parties. It doesn't seem to me that the two theoretical views of existence characterize their own objects as it were only de dicto, meaning as, well, whatever satisfies the principles of the theory. Because if you look at how we actually debate, we have a flatly de re attitude here, meaning that the disagreement does not boil down to each party's arrogating the word existence to name its own feature. Each aims at theorizing on that feature, which is existence, providing a certain characterization of it. There's not that just we have our theory, they have their theory, and that's it. We each claim that our theory gets the real thing right. There is some notion out there, existence, and our account is the right one for that notion. For the Meinongian, that thing is the real feature, okay, a characteristic that some objects have, other things lack. According to the Quinian, or at least to the Quinian who's happy to talk in terms of properties, that wouldn't be Quinian himself because he hated properties, but a properly friendly Quinian, so somebody who's a Quinian on existence, who endorses the view that everything exists, but who likes to talk in terms of properties, well, that feature, it's a trivial feature that anything has, okay? To exist is just to be something, be identical with something. Each party challenges the truth of the proposition expressed by the Q claim and the M claim respectively in the other party's mouth. So the party that happens to be wrong is wrong about the property that the predicate picks out, both in its own mouth and in anyone else's. And it's being wrong is it's having false theoretical beliefs about that property. Good. So if this is a better way to look at the situation, we can then, in the light of this, move on to the second objection, okay? That's the objection from analyticity. Remember, this is different from the first one because this second objection grants that Q and M express contradictory propositions, as it seems to be the case on the face of it, if you just look at the sentences, in the mouth of the two theorizing parties. But according to the proponents of this second objection, the Meinongian theory is an obviously flawed theory. Running wagon again, Meinong's theory has a rather important defect, and that is that it is self-contradictory, obviously self-contradictory. Why? What? Well, the view is that the M claim is a Frege analytic falsity. So I hinted at the beginning what that amounts to. So a sentence is Frege analytic when you can get it from a logical truth by replacement of synonyms, right? So a bachelor is an unmarried man. You get it from a bachelor is a bachelor, which is a logical truth by replacing bachelor with unmarried man, which is a synonym. So that's a Frege analytic truth. So call a sentence which can be obtained from a logical falsity by replacement of synonym. That's a sentence that expresses a Frege analytic falsity or a Frege analytically false proposition. Now, the M claim the objection goes is one such sentence because X exists just is synonymous with there is such a thing as X. They just mean the same. So it is not the case that X exists, it's synonymous with it is not the case that there is such a thing as X. Okay? It's just sameness of meaning going on here. It's a semantic fact. So by one replacement of synonyms, M turns into a logical inconsistency. And Meinong himself specified the inconsistency at issue. There's a famous passage in the Gegenstand theory where Meinong says, those who like paradoxical modes of expression could very well say, there are objects of which it is true that there are no such objects, right? So it seems like you have it from the horse's mouth. I mean, he did say those who like paradoxical modes of expression, right? One may want to take that into account. But anyway, so if somebody comes up with an objection of this kind, of course, the right retort is, where was the evidence? One cannot just assert that X exists is a synonym of there is such a thing as X and get away with it. One must provide evidence on pain of begging the question against the Meinongian, okay? And that seems to be linguistic evidence, right? Because it's a claim of synonymy that's going on there. It's got to do with semantics. And in fact, it seems to be that Quinians often point at linguistic evidence, okay? I'm gonna call the kind of argument they come up with the argument from italics, because when you write it down, you typically will put some words in italics to put the focus on something, to put the stress on something. So here's Van Wagen again. Meinongianism entails that there are things that have no being of any sort. But if there are, italics, such things, they obviously have being. For a thing to have being is for there to be such a thing as it. What else could being be, right? That's like stamp the foot, bang the table, being, can't you see? So the view is something like, to claim that there, italics, to flag the thing, is something that doesn't exist, is to stumble upon the very meaning of there is. No relevant difference can be detected between there is and exists. What could there is stand for, as used in the vernacular, if not what exists stand for? Okay. Now, this kind of remark has promoted, I think, a certain schism between Meinongians, because two claims are actually lumped together here. Claim A is to quantify is to ascribe being to what one quantifies over. Claim B is being is the same as existence. Now, A and B taken together entail that to quantify is to ascribe existence to what one quantifies over. So that being is the same as existence is another key claim of the Quinian meta-ontology, right? It's one of the 5 theses of Van Wagen's famous paper, Meta-ontology. But it is claim A, which is supported by the argument from italics, not claim B. Now, some neo-Meinongians, I think, have felt the pressure of the argument from italics, or some variations of it. They have accepted claim A, granting that there is brings commitment to the being of the things one quantifies over. So to block the conclusion that the Meinongian claim is Frege analytically false, they have denied claim B. So they have granted that everything must have being in some watered down form or other, despite occasionally lacking that supposedly more pregnant kind of being, which is called existence. I don't like this kind of Meinongianism. I think it's a retreat, because by attaching to quantification a kind of watered down ontological commitment, whatever that means exactly, commitment to the watered down being of what one quantifies over, it just looks like a kind of watered down Quinianism. Okay, that's not the view of people like me, or Graham Priest, or Richard, Sylvan, Neeratley, and others. We think that the Meinongian had better attack claim A, accept that being is the same as existence, and claim that some things just lack being, that is to say, existence. And if there are different ways or modes of being, which is something we Meinongians may even be open to, that is to say, existence, some things have none of them. How? By countering alleged linguistic evidence with linguistic evidence. And I think that can be done. Because remember, the argument is really language-based in a sense. So Peter Wangenberg is saying something like, oh, look, there's an occurrence of the verb to be. Stamp the foot, bang the table. It's in the am claim. Can't you see it? There are things that do not exist. Now, granted that being is the same as existence, then the am claim expresses a Frege analytic falsity, and it's, as Peter Wangen says, obviously self-contradictory, or only one substitution step away from logical falsity, because, well, there is an is in there. The reply to which is, well, that the verb to be shows up in some kind of in some of our quantification expressions lends thin linguistic support to the thick, heavy duty meta-ontological claim that we are always committed to the being or existence of whatever we quantify over. The verb to be is accidental to quantification. Quantificational devices in ordinary languages have very different forms. In lots of them, the verb to be, or its counterparts in languages different from English, don't show up at all. English uses some for the same purposes of there is, mostly. Same for Alcuni or Qualche in my native tongue. Germans often use es gibt. We would hardly conclude that they ascribe given or being given to anything they quantify over. Actually, in a sense, being given may be closer than exists to expressing what one often does by quantifying, as we will see. I will refer to the work of a linguist, who also is a native speaker of German, in a couple of slides. Or in French, you typically say il y a, so être doesn't show up. But of course, we wouldn't claim that the Frenchmen are ascribing having the things just because they quantify on them by using the expression il y a. That would be crazy. So the philosopher and linguist at issue is Frederica Moltmann, who was my boss. I was Frederica's postdoc a long time ago. And I think I infected her with interest in the semantics of the verb to exist. And she did some research there. Frederica has a certain methodology for doing ontology. And you may or may not like it. So the meta-ontological view here is something like, oh, let's do ontology by taking on board the intuitions which are deposited in ordinary language use. Something like that, very roughly. Maybe I'm not doing her justice, but you don't even need to like this methodology. I'm resorting to her work because the dialectical point is the Quinians who come up with something like the objection from analyticity, they're making a claim that has to do with the semantics of expressions like there is, some, exists, and so on. Okay, so it's a dialectically appropriate move to go and look then with the seriousness of a linguist, of a semanticist, which is what Frederica is, at how we actually use these expressions and what this tells us about the meanings of these words. So as pointed out by her in a couple of papers, she also has more recent work on this. There is, for some, il y a, es gibt, c'è, si da, and so on. They're often used as locative constructions. Their task is to present the relevant objects, to introduce them in discourse, to situate them in a wider context. And Frederica remarks that if you look at actual language use, they work very differently from exists. For instance, they often come together with locational restrictions, especially when they don't come with mass nouns or plurals. So, for instance, you may say, there are 2 trucks here, there's 2 more down there, or there's a girl waiting in the car, or there was a guy at the door this morning looking for you. Now try and replace the quantification expressions with exist there. That's just unfeasible. You wouldn't claim of the 4 trucks that 2 exist here while 2 exist down there, or that a girl exists in the car waiting, or that a guy existed at the door this morning, and while he existed there, he was looking for you. That's not quite ungrammatical, I'd say, in English, but borderline ungrammatical. Now, that's very bad for a supposedly always substitutable synonym. And synonymy is the claim at the core of the objection from analyticity, okay? Such restrictions, locational restriction, may be okay with mass nouns or bare plurals. They're clearly not okay in the examples that I just gave you. Federica has many more cases in which you can't just substitute one thing with the other. Okay, so quantification expressions do in general a very different job from uses of the verb to exist in ordinary languages like English. So look, let me wrap up and go a general moral, which is something like this. Attempts to refute Meinongians by appealing to a presumed Frege analyticity of the Q claim, everything exists. That's the objection from analyticity in essence. Or to the fact that the mere understanding of the proposition expressed by that claim is sufficient to mandate assent. That's not a promising move. Okay. It's also not promising, I think, to go for easy dismissals like, oh, the Meinongians are just changing the meanings of words. In general, you can easily accuse deviant or minority ontological views of equivocation or analytic falsehood. It's been done many times. For instance, in modern metaphysics, you could reject David Lewis's model realism, right? So the view that the plurality of worlds, which are disconnected space-times, the actual world, just the world we are part of, and so on. You may say, it's analytic that everything is actual. Stamp the food, bang the table. So Lewis's ontology of non-actual possibilia is just analytically false. It's an obvious falsehood. That has been done in the past, parenthetical remark. In the early days of modern realism, some have tried this fast rejection. Look at Richards or Susan Haack or William Lycan again. Of course, that's not how people would argue against Lewis nowadays. Modern realism is a respectable theory on the philosophical market. Many, nearly everybody believes it to be false. Okay, most people have what Lewis called the famous incredulous stare. And maybe it's not just false, it's even necessarily false, given the modal status of its key claims, right? So Lewis makes a number of claims that have metaphysical status. So if they're true, they're necessarily true. If they're false, they're necessarily false. But to show this, one needs more than a quick argument to the effect that such key claims are analytic falsehoods or denials of things that command assent to competent speakers of English. So the most promising attempts to refute the philosophical view may start by assigning to their target as much theoretical strength as charitable interpretation allows. And I think neither of the two objections that I considered do that. Okay, and that's, I think, the fundamental reason why they fail. Okay, that's what I had to say. Thanks for me, and also thanks from this old Austrian guy. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my slides.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Franz, for your great presentation. And if anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand here on Zoom. Or if you are on YouTube, you can write a question down on the chat and we can read it for Franz here online. Okay, I would like to start. And once again, thank you very much for your presentation. And Franz, let's say I accept the distinction between exists and there is. Let's say I'm sold. With that being the case, there are a couple of issues that arise when it comes to the metaphysics of fiction, more specifically. And as we were talking before, I am an artifactualist, and one main motivation for artifactualism is that authors are creative individuals. But when it comes to Meinongianism, it seems like the process of creation is somewhat mysterious because you haven't talked about principles like the comprehension principle or the independence principle. But if these objects, these fiction objects like Sherlock Holmes, they don't exist, but there are such things, and they were there as objects before an author wrote a story about them, what is exactly the author doing when he or she writes a story? Are they creating something? Are they selecting something? And again, if they are selecting, Parsons, for example, had some problems with that. So what does creation mean in fiction according to G. Meinongian? And thank you very much once again.
Yeah, good. So the Meinongian set is, so if you look at the literature, the Meinongians have explored two different ways around this issue. Because let me use Graham Priestley's terminology. He talks about realism and anti-realism, I think. It's a bit of a misleading way of talking, I think. But the difference between the two views is on what he calls the realist view, all of these things are already out there. Which things there are is whatever is entailed by the comprehension principle endorsed by the relevant Meinongian view. And then so Sherlock Holmes was already out there, and Doyle singled out the thing and talked about that. And the problem for this view is how the hell does that happen? Because no causal connection. There's no definite description that picks out exactly one of those many Holmes candidates and so on. And Graham has a reply to that, which has to do with the fact that you can single out things even when you have no causal connection to them. I mean, that kind of reply is supposed to be available to anybody who accepts abstract and existent objects, right? Because we don't have causal connections with abstract objects. But if you believe in numbers, functions, whatever, there's going to be a similar story. But the other view is that the one that he calls misleadingly anti-realist is that you can be a Meinongian who thinks that at least some non-existent objects, which ones? Well, the fictional ones, are produced by the authors. Okay, so in this view, there's no problem with selecting. There's no problem for Doyle in selecting a fictional object which was already out there, or just produced by Doyle. Okay, so no way you could go wrong there. It just came up with a thing. So now the crucial question is, can you produce an object without bringing that into existence? Because that's the thing. So if you go for this view, so this is a Meinongian view that claims some non-existent objects are produced. Right? I emphasize some because you can be a Meinongian on many different kinds of things. You can think that past objects are currently non-existent objects. You can think that mere possibilia are actually non-existent objects. You can think that, I don't know, objects postulated by false scientific theories are non-existent, like ether. You can do that. Objects postulated as ideal objects, like frictional planes, are non-existent, so on. So this is only about specific kind of things of which the Meinongian may want to claim they are among the non-existent, so the fictional characters. You may say, well, those are produced. Okay, and now the easy objection is, oh, how can you produce something without bringing that into existence? Can you create non-existence? I always found that a bit question begging because, I mean, given what we mean by existence, of course you can produce things without bringing them into existence. Because if you mean what many Meinongians mean, take Graham himself. So people like Graham or Silvan Routley, they think that to exist is to have causal features. Okay, so not to exist is to lack causal features or disposition to causal interactions. So if that's okay as a characterization of existence, well, you can produce things that lack causal features. Okay, how you do that, that's a different story. But again, it's a problem for anybody who believes that there are objects that can be produced and which lack causal features, right? So it is the same ballpark as any creationist who's like an abstractionist on fictional objects. So somebody who believes that fictional objects exist, they are abstract objects, and they are produced, must tell a similar story. How is it that Doyle can produce the fictional characters, but that cannot mean cause, in some sense, the relevant things, because there are no causal connections. So supposing there are no causal connections with abstract objects. Okay. Of course, you're about to say that the non-existent has been produced, but that's very consistent with what we mean by existence, right? Which may well be for people like Graham or Routley, Silvan, that have enough causal features. Okay, so that's, I think, the line of reply.
Okay, thank you very much. And Elisa.
Yes, I wanted just to try to compare my intuition with you. concerning the example with there is, and you said correctly that we cannot substitute exist with there is. But my intuition is that in those cases, existence is a presupposition. And so if you put presupposition in focus, they give some inferences. They make some inferences which maybe are not required. So if we assume that there is presupposed existence, that would explain why we cannot substitute there is with exist. So I wanted to see how would you react to such a kind of observation.
Yeah. So would that be a retractable presupposition? So I say, oh, a girl existed, a guy existed at the door this morning. And you say, wait, what the hell are you talking about? You mean there was a guy at the door this morning? Is that's like a retractable thing, like a conversational implicator?
In order to say that there is a guy,
Yeah.
the guy could be existing. That's what I would say. So it is in this sense, it is a presupposition. To put into focus the presupposition, which is taken for granted, requires some inferences which probably are not.
I was talking about retractability because it's just my memory of how Friederike Moltmann handles the issue there. Because I think that the line of reply there is something like, "I can't be a presupposition because a presupposition cannot take you from a perfectly acceptable sentence to one which is borderline ungrammatical." So there's something wrong going on there with that analysis. So it would be very weird if a presupposition, so not a component of meaning, generates such a switch from a conversational perfectly appropriate sentence to one which is borderline ungrammatical. So that it was strange to analyze that as a presupposition failure. I think Friederike considers a position like the one that you mentioned. And that will be the line of reply, I think. I asked you about retractability because I read the paper many years ago, but she connected that to what is retractable in the same sense of conversational implicators. It cannot be something which is a presupposition or an implication, so it doesn't got to do with a proposition with a meaning. When having it and taking it away makes you move from a sentence which is completely fine, which one that sounds weird, if not borderline ungrammatical. Because I mean, a guy existed at the door this morning is not how people talk, right? So yeah.
Obviously not, because when we say that, then I leave space to others. When you say that exists, you are denying that it doesn't exist, and that seems a strange thing. But I leave space to others. Sorry.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Elisa and Fiora.
So it's my turn now. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you for your talk. And I have a question that just came to my mind while you were talking now, and I was thinking. So personally, I'm not a believer, but I like the sophisticated ways of formalizing basically the ways in which we talk about non-existent objects in a meaningful way, right? But sometimes, so there are situations, I know that many reject the distinction between, like, the intuition that we had, that there is a distinction between there is and there exists. And exactly from the linguistic evidence, but there are cases in which it seems to be important that we make the distinction. And one simple case of thinking about very concrete examples with children, right? So a child scared of some non-existent monster, right? There are also real monsters, but the non-existent ones, right? The one lurking under the bed or whatever, right? The one that doesn't let them sleep at night. So you can tell the child that you can make this distinction, right? So monsters do not exist. However, in fairy tales, there are monsters. We can talk about them and we can say things that are correct and incorrect, true or false, depending on what the story says. So there are ways of making sense of this distinction. I guess we need a way to keep, I mean, this is a very simple case, but there's plenty of cases where we want to say there is no polyphemus, or there exists no polyphemus, but there is one. Or what was the example? There are no one-eyed giants, but there are some in, so you always need an index, right? You need to specify where. And so there seems to be an important difference there. And usually we draw the difference by appealing to the distinction between fiction and reality, right? Okay, I'll stop there. Sorry, just a train of thought, trying to see how we can make space for this distinction in a meaningful way. Okay, I'll stop.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree particularly with anything. Of course, the Meinongian can say, like anybody else, there are no such things as blah blah blah, and that may mean just there are no such things, because there are lots of things of which we may mean by that. Take the totality of things, you won't find that, okay? Or we may just mean there are no such things relative to a restricted context, or in a world, or in a situation, or in a location, and so on. So that's a contextually restricted form of claim. Or we may want to say that's a non-existent thing, okay? And we can be, so what we Meinongian say can be analyzed making all of the same distinctions that you can make for anybody else. It's just that, so we think there is an additional distinction that the Quinians don't make, and that shows up from ordinary language, okay? But the fact that claims which are not flat denials of existence, so the word to exist doesn't show up there, but they're out of the form, there is no such thing as blah, 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 we can be completely on board with the view that such claims can be contextually restricted and so on. Like I say, we're in Berlin and they say, oh, there are no dolphins. Plausibly what I mean is, well, looking just around here in the city, maybe even at the zoo of Berlin, there are no dolphins, okay? So considering only things in the relevant domain of quantification, dolphins are not in there. And that's what I am legitimately interpreted as saying, as somebody who's in Berlin and who makes that claim, even I as a Meinongian. So that's perfectly fine as a way of understanding what I'm doing when with claims of whom there are no such thing as blah blah blah. They can be simply restricted, contextually restricted claims to the fact that looking only at things in this context, in this domain, in this location, in this world, and so on, the thing we're talking about is not in there, and that's fine. Yeah, is that sometimes we also claim that in ordinary language we want to say things like that thing is non-existent, but it is there in the relevant domain. Okay, that's the extra point that we Meinongians want to push. But the fact that denials of the form there are no such thing as blah 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 can be restricted to times, locations, domains, worlds, and so on, that's fine. We're on board with that, like everybody else. Yeah.
Perfect. Any follow-ups?
And it's just a finger. So, but about the distinction between reality and fiction, is there something more substantial than just an index?
Oh,
That was yeah, the end of that. Sorry, it came late.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
that
that's
was
right.
the most
Yeah, I didn't say
important
anything on
thing
that.
for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's an internal schism between Meinongians because Meinongians like myself or Graham or Ed Zalta too, we claim, for instance, that Sherlock Holmes is not actually and really a detective. Sherlock Holmes is only a detective in the Doyle fiction. So it's only true within the fiction that Sherlock Holmes is a detective. But it's not really actually true of Sherlock Holmes that he is a detective. So there are lots of features ascribed to fictional objects within fiction that don't transfer to what these things are actually like, what they're like in the actual world. What is actually true of things like Holmes is that they're non-existent, that they're fictional characters, that they have been invented by Doyle, that we are thinking about them now, that they're more famous than any real detective, and so on. But these are things which are actually true, not true in the fiction, or possibly not true in the fiction. Lots of other things are only true in the fiction for these things. And for instance, one of them for Holmes is that he's a detective. There's other Meinongians who don't think like that. Meinongians of the Terence Parsons school think that it's actually true, not just true in the fiction, that Holmes is a detective. So you can ask them, wait, if he's a detective, why can't I go and shake hands? Because this detective is going to be a human being or something like that. And they're going to say, oh, it's a detective, but it's a non-existent detective. And he does live in Baker Street, but it's a non-existent Baker Street, and so on. We think that gives a less natural treatment of ascription of properties to fictional objects within fictions. Okay, and we have a long story as to why that would be so. So that's yeah. So we have a different Meinongians have different ways of carving the distinction between what is true in the actual world, in the real world of fictional objects, and what is only true within a fiction. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And Eleonora?
Thank you for the talk. I have a doubt. It's a clarification question. If I understood correctly, the idea of the linguistic argument against the identification of being with existence is that there are some context, linguistic context in which you cannot replace the one expression for the other. But it seems to me you cannot say things like there exists a girl in the car, for instance. You have to stick to there is a girl in the car or things like that. But it seems to me that I'm not completely sure about whether this linguistic argument can be solid enough to ground the difference between being and existence, because it seems to me that the difference is completely, the conceptual difference is not necessarily attached to this impossibility of substituting one word for the other in every context. Because, for instance, we don't say things like Napoleon doesn't exist. We say Napoleon died or had died. But that doesn't mean that we really mean that he doesn't exist any longer. In a clear sense, he doesn't exist. He's not among the existent beings. So now my point is that whether whether we mean existence by being is related to something else and not necessarily to the way we talk. It might be related. It might be a general, I don't know, presupposition agreed upon and part of the common ground of the conversation, as Fiora was saying about whether if we are talking about fiction or about fictional entities, well, we can use, I don't know, there are good monsters and bad monsters, and we let existence out of the landscape. But so my point is, maybe it's a bit confusing, but my point is that the conceptual difference between existence and being doesn't seem to be necessarily related to the way we use the words. So I don't know how strong you take the linguistic evidence or the linguistic argument to be.
Good. Nice. So take things one at a time. First, one thing is the distinction or supposed distinction between being and existence. Another distinction is the distinction or supposed distinction between the meaning of the expression to exist and the meaning of quantificational expressions, like for some, for all, blah, blah, blah. It's the latter one which is at the core of the argument that I talked about, not the former, because there are Meinongians who accept the difference between being and existence. And there are Meinongians who reject that there's any difference between being and existence. And I actually belong to the latter camp. I'm one of those who claim that being and existence, same thing. So that's not really the issue. The issue is the meaning of exist and the meaning of quantificational expressions like for all, for some, there is, there are, and so on. Okay, that's the issue. Now, if you say, oh, linguistic evidence here is shaky, intuitions may be all over the place, I may even agree. But the thing is, so resorting to linguistic evidence is dialectically appropriate in the context of the discussion of the argument, because that's what the other party has started to do first. So the Quinians, like Van Inwagen, are the people who come up with the argument, oh, can't you see that there is means the same as exists? Okay, that you got it in the language. Okay, what else could there is such a thing as X means if not X exists? Okay, means, they say. So they're the ones who resort to the meanings of these to considerations that have to do with the meanings of these expressions in ordinary language. So if resorting to linguistic evidence here is inappropriate, it's inappropriate for both parties. Yeah, that's why I said when I quickly introduced Frederick Moltmann's view, I said, yeah, you may not like this way of doing ontology, which has to do with, oh, let's look at linguistic evidence. Okay, let's look at intuitions which are somehow extracted from how we talk, how we use words, because maybe intuitions are all over the place and so on. And that's fine by me. But if the other party, the Quinians, start invoking linguistic intuitions, well, then it's legitimate for us to do the same when we reply to them. Okay, so that's just about coming up with linguistic counter evidence to evidence. So that's why I think the move is dialectically appropriate. Okay, that doesn't rule out that one may be an ontologist who said, yeah, methodologically, let's not use language. Let's not use language. Let's not resort to ordinary language intuitions because they're all over the place. Okay, and they agree that they sometimes are all over the place. For instance, so going back to your example, I believe it's literally and perfectly true that George Washington doesn't exist or Napoleon doesn't exist. That means for me, it's a currently non-existent object, was existent in the past, doesn't exist anymore. But not everybody needs to follow me, and it's even controversial that intuitions from ordinary language point in this direction. Some Meinongians have this view. There are like Meinongian presentists, so people who think like presentism, what really exists, it is what presently exists. Okay. But that doesn't mean that because they're Meinongians, what is present is all there is. It means the only existent things are the present things. There are past things, they're just non-existent. Maybe there are even future things, I don't know. They're non-existent yet, okay? But you don't even need to follow this way, because again, if you look at linguistic intuitions of how we use thanks notions of existence, the idea of past non-existent, that may also be all over the place. So the point is only if the Quinians start coming up with linguistic evidence for the claim, it's dialectically appropriate to come up with linguistic counter evidence.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Just one parenthesis. Some people ask me how they can raise their hands on Zoom. If you're having any trouble, you just see the menu down here. There's a button for React. Then you click on it, and there's the option Raise Hand, right? So, Jersey.
Yes, thanks for the talk, Professor Berto. I have a question that is kind of related, but not directly, I think, to your talk, but it has more to do with what you said about Sherlock Holmes not being an actual detective in that other versions of Meinongianism.
Yeah, cool.
So, because the way I see it, something like the principle of comprehension is an advantage of Meinongianism in order to solve questions about individuation. How do we individuate an objects that do not exist, and so on. So if we sort of empty Sherlock Holmes of all its properties, then what are we left with? How can we individuate this object and count and say that Sherlock Holmes is a different object from some other fictional or non-existent object? And just a related question to this one is, how do you view the relations between properties? For example, the Golden Mountain. I know that you have written that some properties can imply other properties, like say, well, if it's a mountain, then it must be a concrete object, right? So would you say that the principle of comprehension is a good way for us to individuate objects, or should we give it up and go for something else? Thank you.
Good, thanks. So lots of stuff in there. So the principle of comprehension or characterization, which is embedded in, there's different principles of comprehension or characterization, which are embedded in different Meinongian formalized views. They themselves can't do a lot of work when it's about the individuation of objects, because those principles tell you which objects there are according to the theory, okay? Just like the comprehension principle for a theory of sets tells you which sets there are according to the theory, okay? But that doesn't tell you what the identity of sets consists in. What tells you about the identity of sets is the extensionality principle for sets, so same member, same set, okay? So similarly, in Meinongian theories, there is a comprehension principle that tells you which objects there are, whether existence, so whatever is entailed by the principle. But then there's also some kind of identity criterion. That's the one that's supposed to tell you when A and B are the same object, existent or not. Okay. Of course, there's an interaction between the two sorts of principles. And there's different identity criteria for objects in object theories of the Meinongian kind. You may rightly say, oh, but you're gonna have to use the properties of these objects if you want to individuate them. So the question is, well, what kind of properties do these things actually have? And I don't think it's literally true, but intuitively you may say, oh, if you're a Meinongian of the nuclear Terence Parsons kind, they have more properties, their objects, it seems, than the objects as characterized, at least the fictional ones in particular, the objects as characterized by other kinds of Meinongianism, like the Graham Priest or the Ed Zalta dual copula Meinongianism. But I mean, what is actually true, a more precise way of phrasing the difference is to say, according to Meinongianisms of the nuclear Terence Parsons kind, fictional objects have at the actual world, or actually or really, certain properties which, according to us, they don't have at the actual world, or literally or really. Okay, so in the Terence Parsons view, again, Sherlock Holmes really is a detective, so actually has the feature of being a detective. That's not so for Graham or myself. We only claim Sherlock Holmes has the feature of being a detective at the worlds that make true the relevant fiction. Ed Zalta says Sherlock Holmes only encodes the property of being a detective, because Ed has this notion of encoding. That's different from exemplifying the property. So also according to Ed, Sherlock Holmes is not really a detective, where is the ease of exemplification. But of course, even for us, that doesn't rule out that there's lots of other properties that they have, because they have those properties in the priest and my case at those worlds. So it is actually true that Sherlock Holmes is a detective at the Doyle worlds, or at the worlds that realize the fiction. So Sherlock Holmes, even for us, actually has the property of being a detective in those fictional worlds, which for us is the same as being a detective according to the relevant fictional stories. So there's still plenty of properties for our fictional non-existence to have at the actual world. It's just that they come in modalized version or suitably qualified version. Now, why would you go this way rather than go in the literalist way of people like Parsons and nuclear Meinongians? So why would you reject the claim that Sherlock Holmes actually and really has the feature of being a detective? Well, the story we tell is something like, well, there are some intuitive connections between properties. And it seems intuitive that the having of some properties entails the having of some other properties, at least at the actual world, and I think also in any possible world, that's the case. So there is something, if somebody is characterized as a detective, by default, they're going to be a human being or something like that, or a rational thing. If something is characterized as a human being, by default, they're going to have a body. So they're going to have causal features. So they're going to exist, right? These are natural entailments. And the Parsons nuclear property view is supposed to break these intuitive entailments between properties, because they are supposed to say, yeah, it's actually a detective, but it's a detective that doesn't actually exist. So it's a detective that doesn't have a body, or maybe it's a detective that has a body, but it's a non-existent body. We think our treatment is overall more natural, okay? But it's a subtle dialectic there. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Great. I have a follow-up to Jersey's question, actually. And my question is twofold, because on the one hand, is the Meinongian assuming that fictional objects are incomplete objects? And if they are, how can it be the case that, for example, Sherlock Holmes has the property of being made of flesh and blood, and at the same time being a material object that is incomplete if we assume that material objects are, by definition, if it is, complete? And on the other hand, it is a follow-up to Jose's question, because it is related to identity of fictional characters, in the sense that if there are as many Sherlock Holmes as there are properties about Sherlock Holmes and different objects, Holmes 1, Holmes 2, Holmes 3, etc., how can the author know that he or she is writing about the right character when he or she writes the story? Because, for example, let's say that when Conan Doyle was writing A Study in Scarlet, he wanted to write about the Sherlock Holmes that was a detective, a friend of Watson, that smoked a pipe, but had, I don't know, an even number of hair strands. But by accident, he wrote about Sherlock Holmes that was a detective, that was a friend of Watson, that smoked a pipe, but had a different number of, I don't know, hair. How can we accommodate these two intuitions? So on the one hand, um, if fictional objects are incomplete, how can a material object be incomplete? And on the other hand, how can we exactly individuate a fictional object if we're doing it by their properties? And thanks
Right.
again.
Nice. Cool. Yeah. So first, let's see if we are on the same page on what it means that an object is incomplete. That means for some property P, the object is in the domain, but it's neither P nor not P. Is that what you have in mind by incompleteness?
I think it's a little bit different. I'm assuming
Okay.
that if an object is complete, then for whatever property, it is either the case or is not the case that that object has that property. In the sense that if I am a complete object, it is the case that I have 1 meter and 83 centimeters of height. And it is not the case that I am, I don't know, 1 meter and 50 centimeters of height. But on the other hand, when it comes to fictional objects, if the object is incomplete, what I'm saying is that I can't affirm or deny that that object has that property. So it is incomplete. For example, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, I got you now. So you bracket in the case of properties for which the object is just not in the range. Like take, I don't know, being transparent versus being opaque. And I ask you, oh, is the number 2 transparent or opaque? And you mean that's a category mistake to ask this kind of thing. Okay, so bracketing that. Fine. I claim fictional objects understood the Meinongian in the sense of understood in the way of the kind of Meinongianism that I endorse. They're not incomplete. They're perfectly complete. Ed Zalta would say the same of his own objects that encode property. Because I mean, for him, when it's about exemplification, Sherlock Holmes for Ed is an encoding features object, an object that encode a property encoder. Sherlock Holmes is perfectly complete when it's about exemplification. In a sense, it's not complete when it's about the property that Sherlock Holmes encodes, but that's because for Ed, basically, there's no logic for encoding. So from the fact that an object encodes P, nothing follows on what are the features Q the object may or may not encode. So it's a kind of peculiar incompleteness. So anyway, kind of Meinongian that I endorse, fictional objects are perfectly complete. So cases like, does Sherlock Holmes have an odd or an even number of hair? Okay, that kind of stuff. Story doesn't tell, let's suppose. Okay, that's just, you handle that in the ordinary way in which you handle the underspecification of fiction when you have a world semantics apparatus. In some worlds it goes one way, in some others it goes another way. There's some worlds in which Holmes that are compatible with the Doyle stories in which Holmes has an odd number of hairs, and there's some worlds in which are compatible with the Doyle stories in which Holmes has an even number of hairs, or whichever of the two. Okay, that's the same for me, right? That you can tell there are stories about me which I have an odd number of hair, and there's stories about me in which I have an even number of hair. And you may say, okay, but you actually have hair. So there's a fact of the matter as to your number. Either the number of hair in my head is odd or it's even. Fine. So what about Holmes? I say, in my Meinongianism, well, there's no such thing as Sherlock Holmes' hair, because he's a damn non-existent object. So it doesn't have a body, and in particular doesn't have hair. What is true of Holmes is only that he has hair in the Doyle stories. Okay, odd or even number, well, the story doesn't tell. So there are some worlds compatible with the Doyle stories where it's an odd number, and there's some worlds compatible with the Doyle stories when it's an even number. And that's all there is. But there's not so, I think this view that if you buy the Meinongian conception according to which there are non-existent objects and the fictional objects are among them, then you come up with objects which are metaphysically weird, radically incomplete, and so on. That's all bad stuff. You don't need any of that. The Meinongians should not be committed to anything like that. They're perfectly ordinary objects in the sense in particular that in your sense of completeness, they're completely complete. Other thing is how do you single out and so on. So I already told you something about that there are these two views, the realist and the anti-realist, again, using Graham's somewhat misleading terminology. In the realist view, Holmes was already out there, Doyle only selected the thing. I'll come back to this. In the anti-realist view, which is the one that I unpacked for you 20 minutes ago, Doyle produces Holmes. So there is no problem as to how he manages to refer to that thing because he just produced the thing, that thing that he produced. In the realist option, so Holmes was already out there. How you single that out? I don't much like the initial story Graham Priest came up with. You single out by a purely mental act of pointing. Seems like crazy to me. But I very much like, for independent reasons, a theory which is called the theory of arbitrary reference, which has been defended by a number of people. and which can be straightforwardly applied to the case of Meinongian fictional objects in the realist interpretation. So in the reading in which they're already out there, we're just seeing them out. And the theory of arbitrary reference just says, well, in some cases, you refer by using a term arbitrarily. That doesn't mean that you are referring to an exotic object, an arbitrary object in Kit-Fine sense. You're just referring to an ordinary thing arbitrarily, and you don't know which one it is, and you cannot know which one it is, but still it's successful reference. The view has a number of problems, but I like it. It's been developed independently from the issue of non-existent objects, right? It's like, when the teacher at school says, oh, Fido is a dog who eats a kilo of meat every month. How much does Fido eat in a year, and so on? Fido is an arbitrary name, right? So if some kid asks, oh, is Fido a beagle? That seems like a stupid question to ask, because the teacher could well say, look, that's an arbitrary dog, right? Doesn't make sense to wonder whether it's a beagle or not a beagle, but some other kind of dog. But if you're a fan of arbitrary reference, you're not going to conclude that Fido names an arbitrary dog, like an object which is radically incomplete because it's somehow a dog, but it's neither a beagle, nor a German Shepherd, nor a Basset Hound, and so on. So indeterminate dog. You just say, look, Fido, just name some dog, ordinary dog, okay? We don't know which one it is. We cannot know, but the reference just works that way sometimes, okay? And I like this line of reply.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And just so you know, in my fan fiction, Fido is actually a stray yellow dog, stray yellow Brazilian dog. But anyway, thank you very much for your response. And Hishan?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Hello, thank you, Professor Berto, for the very interesting talk. My question is related to what both Italo and Diege mentioned, namely the problems of ficta properties and generation. And of course, as you mentioned, there's no principle of generation in the historical Meinongs, since we can only talk about the selection principle. And that, but that aside, my question is about the properties of ficta, or ausdesigned entities in general, that Meinong speaks of. These properties are usually tackled by neo-Meinongians with two distinctions in mind. As you know, the property kinds, like in Parsons, and modes of predication, as in Voltolini or Edward Zalta. And I think the predication modes is widely accepted amongst neo-Meinongians, but as I conceive of Zalta's predication modes, I think it falls prey to this problem of individuation that you talked about a few moments ago. Namely, how can sets of properties generate ficta, sets of properties on their own? I think this is a problem for Zalta, even though he admits authorial creativity, unlike the historical Meinong, but he still, I think Zalta prioritizes properties. So he speaks, for example, of Sherlock as having the properties he encodes. So I think these properties, these bundles of properties, are somehow out there in a Platonic realm, so to speak, and Sherlock is the entity that encodes this property. So I think he still prioritizes properties over authorial creativity. And I was just wondering if you would agree that neo-Meinongians, like Zalta, would need to admit this role of authorial creativity as having ontological precedence over properties, and if this would be a problem if they don't, as I think it is, and as I argue in one of my papers, that this is exactly one of the main problems that neo-Meinongians have, and Meinong in general, Meinongianism in general, is that they treat these properties, this Zosein, as Meinong speaks of, as being somehow ontologically prior to authorial creativity, and there is no principle of grounding ausdesigned as Zosein if we don't refer to authorial creativity.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, not sure I can speak for Ed on this, but I'll try. So whatever I say is my responsibility. Maybe he will disagree. So the way things work for the Zalta brand of Meinongianism is something like comprehension principle is you got all the properties out there. Take any bunch of properties. There's going to be one and only one object that encodes all and only those properties. Okay. That's not exactly right, because he needs to have some restrictions on properties. Otherwise, you get some paradox that I even forgot what it's called. Anyway, if you cannot assume, even if you add, that any set of properties whatsoever will deliver some objects which encodes all and only those properties. Otherwise, you run into a paradox. There's some minimal restriction. Doesn't matter. That's kind of the idea. And when it comes to fictional objects, I remember a story that is something like, so pinning the name Sherlock Holmes to the fictional character is a kind of extended baptism. So yeah, Doyle comes up with a long story, and the whole story somehow is supposed to provide the relevant characterization. And out of that, you can pick out a bunch of properties. There's some kind of logical closure going on. So not only those, but something which is entailed by that. I don't even remember very well that. So that's me just not remembering at Zalta in detail. But that gives you one and only one thing. So I think I may agree that given roughly something like this story, there is some kind of ontological priority as you speak for properties of fictional characters, because what's going on is that, well, I mean, talking of principles of generation here is a bit misleading, because it's not that things are generated literally, right? Like when you speak about comprehension principles for theories of sets, generation would be misleading, because if you have a pretty standard, let's say, broadly Platonic views of sets, it's not that sets are produced. They're out there, and the principle tells you what sets there are. So also in this case, for Ed, the generation principles that's not really about object production. It's just that the principle works in such a way that it tells you, if you want to know which objects there are according to the theory, well, you got a bunch of properties. Take any set of those properties subject to minimal restrictions to avoid paradox. There's going to be one and only one thing that encodes exactly those. Okay, that's the principle. But then it seems that objects are not really generated by anyone. They're just out there, and somehow Doyle singles out a thing which is already there. It's the unique thing that encodes a package of features, and this package of features is somehow singled out via the storytelling of that Doyle carries out. I think that would be the Ed Zalta story. So I think it's fine to read that, if you want to call it that way, as some ontological priority of properties, and says that you start with the properties to see which objects there are. Okay, nobody produces anything. It's just a way to make sense of which objects there are. And it's, in a sense, it's at least conceptually, it's a property first approach. And additionally, I think for Ed, unless he changed his view in the last, I don't know, 20 years, because I haven't read anything from him on fiction that's more recent than 20 years ago, I think. Holmes is already out there. It's just an abstract object, as he calls it, that encodes property. And what Doyle does is just singling out the object by telling a story, which for Ed works like kind of an extended baptism or something like that. Okay. So all that Doyle does is pinning a name on a property encoder, which was already out there. So not a lot of authorial creativity, if you want to mean something more substantive by creativity. Okay. So Doyle has produced nothing new in a sense. And if you find that unsatisfactory, yeah, well, then that's your view. Yeah, on the so-called realist version of the modal Meinongian view by Graham, that's also the same, because also in the realist view of the modal Meinongian Graham Priest view, in the realist version, Doyle has produced nothing. Doyle has just singled out a non-existent which was already out there. So if you think that these kind of views don't do justice to authorial creativity, well, yeah, I see why one may come up with that kind of remark.
Yeah, it's interesting, this Zalta's baptism criterion, so to speak. But as you know, for this idea that we cannot talk about a fictional object until it is created, until the author is done with its creation. I think it goes against how we ordinarily read fiction. For example, that we know that that Doyle, when he started writing about Sherlock Holmes, he says, first wrote like a few descriptions, and then later and later that were added embellishments, as Sainsbury writes. So the Sherlock Holmes is a fictional object was an early stage.
I agree
and then
on that.
like more characters were properties were added to it. Yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah,
I think I agree on that. I should say that the same kind of issue. So, what exactly is authorial creation when it's about creating fictional characters? Exactly when that happens? How do you deal with the fact that sometimes somebody creates some character supposedly, and then there's a bunch of stories coming up, like 7 generations of Star Trek characters, and it's not clear when it's the same Spock and when it's not the same Spock anymore. Anybody who's in some sense a realist on fictional character has questions to answer there, even when one is a realist in the sense that one believes that they are existent abstract objects, right? That they are somehow produced. There are all of these similar questions. Those who don't have these issues are people who are anti-realists on fictional objects, so people who claim there are no such things. We just make believe that there are. So fictionalists can tell a different story there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are running out of time. We still have 4 minutes. So Christian, do you have a really, really, really short question?
No, I think my question is already answered. I just want to ask if Gandalf the Grey is the same character as Gandalf the White in the second book of the Lord of the Rings. So I think it's having in mind the comprehension principle. It's a updating version of the properties of Gandalf, or is 2 different characters?
Let's see. What are the intentions here? Well, you look at what's told in the story and you try to make sense of that in the light of your background knowledge and beliefs. So if that's not settled by intuitions, it would not be different from a case which is not settled by intuitions in the actual world. So my intuition here would be like, yeah, it's just the same guy that went through some kind of radical change. In the same sense in which maybe, I don't know, some guy in the real world goes through radical changes and transformation, but we may still want to say it's the same guy. These are cases in which intuitions may be all over the place. And usually what we do is, well, we go back to analogies or similarities with things that go on in the actual world. But I mean, I don't even think it's up to a general account of truth in fiction and fictional objects to take a stance on these cases. It may actually be a virtue of an account which is that it is flexible enough to accommodate the divergent intuitions, I think. When intuitions don't clearly point in the right direction, then it's a virtue of a theory of truth in fiction and fictional objects that it's able to go both ways, not a vice, I think. But that's just my methodological stance. So if you got the intuition that it's two different guys, Gandalf the Grey and Gandalf the White, which I just don't share, and if that's widespread, then it's a virtue of a good account of truth in fiction and fictional stories that it doesn't take a stance and it can model it both ways. But that's just my view on one of the features that a good theory of truth in fiction and of fictional characters should have. Yeah. What do you think? Is that the same guy? I think it's the same guy, but
I think it's the same guy.
So yeah, okay.
That's great. So thank you very much, Franz, for your presentation. Thank you. So this was our opening conference for the second International Colloquium on the Metaphysics and Semantics of Fiction. So at 2 p.m. Brasilia time, GMT -3, we're going to have a new session starting with Meryl Semaine with the presentation Hoaxing, Deception and Fiction, Then Gabriel Anderson Eugenio with Trivial Inferences to Fictional Entities, and Hisham Yaka Blaustein Ingarde and the Paradox of Fiction. Then at 4 p.m., Brasilia time again, we're going to have Amy Kind with the conference Empathy, Imagination, and the Epistemic Value of Fiction. And for those who are going to make their presentations, if you can arrive in Zoom, let's say 15 minutes earlier than the start of the presentation, that's going to be awesome. And that's it. So Franz, thank you very much once again, and everybody who's here on Zoom and